Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm very, very happy to have Pieter Hugo here with us for a conversation. Hi, Pieter. How are you?
Hey, Ron.
So I've been spending a lot of time looking at your website and looking at your work. And uh, I wanted to use as a starting point your Rwanda project, Vestiges of Genocide. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah. So this was in 2004. I was mainly still primarily working as a documentary photographer for publications and NGOs. And it had been 10 years since the genocide in Rwanda in 1994 had happened. And I was on a plane reading a copy of The Economist. And there was a photograph of a church altar that had a human skull on it. And the article accompanying, in a typical Economist fashion, the image was uncaptioned. But the article was kind of calling to reburial of the mass graves and calling to a swift resolution of the court cases that were happening. Anyway, I reached out to the journalist of the article, and he told me that that photograph had actually been taken, very recently, and that there was still all the detritus of the Rwandan genocide was still all around. And it got me thinking about, for start, how one lives in such a place. How does one deal with the aftermath of this kind of event? Got me thinking about the imbalances between the kind of global north and south. Like, imagine 10 years after the storming of the beaches in Normandy, if the corpses were still lying there, hadn't been reburied or commemorated properly. And so I decided to set out and photograph the structure of the Rwandan genocide. And I reached out to a bunch of different publications that I was working for at the time. And none of them were really interested in helping me do this. So I decided to do it myself, and went with a bag of, a large format film, and went to Rwanda. Spent a few months there. What you don't see on what you sliding through the images here is that all the images have very extended captions, and that is. I was working with a forensic journalist who really documented the structure of how the Rwandan genocide was funded and came about through international kind of channeling of funds and France's role in this. Which I think is particularly important to those images.
And this is the article which is also on your site with information on there. There's a very comprehensive description. I learned a whole lot by reading that.
By Linda Melvin, yes. She's the journalist that I worked with.
Yes.
But the book was eventually, we put it together as a book, but it took me almost 10 years to find a publisher for it.
Wow.
I was working with a French agency, Agence Vue, at the time.
Yeah.
We couldn't get anyone to run the pictures. It just took time. France, to this day, I think, is very reticent to acknowledge its position in the genocide because of the financial implications of what that will mean.
Right.
I assume that's the main reason. Anyway, eventually we published the book, and it was a great book. It was a publication I'm very happy with. And it was actually good to have a bit of distance from the work before getting it out into the world. And it made it to the Badger and Parr Photo Book 3, the history of the photo book.
I found these photographs extremely moving. And you also speak about the fact that, the photographs are powerful because of what is absent in them. They're not the gore of war. They're not the blood and the guts and the atrocities that happened. They're extremely quiet, but they're quiet in the form of a silent shout. They remind me, and I think that you make this analogy between this and prior genocides. They remind me photographs of abandoned camps from World War II. See the remains of the atrocities that happened.
Yeah, I mean,
documenting. It's not war photography, right?
No, I mean, I think one thinks of the camp photographs and the photographs of the kind of Muslim people coming out of the camps. That's got a different energy. This is much more the legacy of history and its imprint on landscape. And
actually, I was thinking more of the piles of shoes and the piles of watches and the remains of what happened.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I was referring that it's not like the kind of Lee Miller-esque, like
absolutely. I'm speaking more of these silent images, and these are not images that you would typically see in a journal article about atrocities, about the genocide. And you speak of this as a transition between documentary photography, between editorial photography, and your art practice.
Yeah, Ron, I mean, I think it's interesting that the journey I've taken to get to in my practice, I don't think it exists anymore. Like, I came from an era of working as a photojournalist,
right,
and migrated into a slow journalism, mainly portraiture based. An era when magazines still had money and you could pitch ideas to them.
Sure.
And they would say, okay, cool, go photograph child slaves in the Sudan for 2 months.
Yes.
And then that world ended. But it was a great way to learn your craft and to kind of get work done and resolve deadlines and things such as that. And then when that ended, it kind of coincided with around the time that I went to Rwanda. I was getting really frustrated with the work that I was doing for publications anyway, because I often felt like I was working as an illustrator for a journalist's ideas, and that often these things, it felt very, very compromised to me, and increasingly inauthentic.
Sure.
And at that time, there was also, fortunately, I met people who had galleries, and I'd been working on some personal projects, and they were very encouraging and helpful in helping me move into that space, which was incredibly liberating. It was great.
Sure. I mean, you're talking about the tail end of things that happened in the great age of editorial photography, things like Life and Look, right? Eugene Smith can travel to Japan and make this amazing photographs, but also this very poignant article about Minamata, right? Those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Where these are publications where the work of the photographer as a journalist and as a person of ideas really came to the forefront, as opposed to, as you're describing it, illustrating the workings of the journalist, right? The background music.
Exactly, where the pictures had a kind of a real agency in their own right.
Sure. And then this project of the genocide in Rwanda led into 1994.
Yeah, much later though.
Yeah,
a lot happened between those two.
1994 is the year, not the time of making the project.
Yeah. So 1994 is a project I made, photographing children in South Africa and Rwanda that were born before the year 1994. And in 1994, in my life, two big events happened. The Rwandan genocide, but also South Africa's first democratic elections where we elected Nelson Mandela. These two kind of big meta-narratives. And I think maybe it's because of having had my own children, I became interested in people born after these events in those spaces and how that history imprints on them or doesn't. What does it mean to them? And obviously these pictures are not like a literal interpretation of that, but that's kind of what was happening in the back of my head when I made these images. Yeah, 1994 is this, to me, it's like this kind of almost like, it's like a flame and I'm this moth that just circles it. Mm-hmm. Almost all my work somehow ties into these two pivotal events.
Yeah. Oh, so this is a thread that continues beyond this.
I think if one looked through other work of mine, you could find elements of that definitely in there.
Mm-hmm. I was reading what Ashraf Jamal was saying about this. He describes you as Hugo, who is commonly mistaken as a documentary photographer. That was a brilliant way of putting it. And he speaks to, I'm assuming that you guys spoke a lot before he wrote this, right? Or had some conversations, because he seems to be echoing a lot of the points that you're making. And he talks about the agency of the camera and the power of the camera. And this idea of a photograph which by its nature still has the presumption of being documentary. But in your photographs, part of their power is that these are not street shots, right? You're not walking around with your Leica downtown and snapping pictures of the people that you see. These are carefully chosen and selected and arranged, and the people, more often than not, are staring directly at you and consequently directly at us, directly in dialogue with you as the maker of the photograph, with me as the person who is looking at the photograph.
Yeah.
Where does that come from? What is where does this choice of the way that you and the subject communicate to come up with this result come from?
Ron, I think, early on in my photographic career, when I was working as a photojournalist, I realized early on that I was really not good at a kind of verite, fly on the wall approach. I'm a big guy, and I guess I just found the interaction of making a portrait and announcing oneself and collaborating with the subject and trying to see what sparks out of that, what sparks you get from that interaction, was interesting to me. You're meeting someone, you have a certain rapport or not, or tension or easygoingness. It's hard to quantify these things. And then there's the environment that you find yourself in, and trying to find a solution, a visual solution out in the world in some way, I guess. And acknowledging that I am present in this dynamic, announcing my presence in a way, being present.
And I think by extension, it makes me feel present, right? Because effectively I'm looking through your eye at what it is that you're seeing.
Yeah, you take my place when the pictures get presented in a gallery or in a book or as an NFT or whatever. Yeah.
And the gaze is always quite sharp, right? It's always directed at you, very focused at you as the photographer. The subjects seem very present. But what I'm curious about, one talks about journalistic photography and the veracity of the image. right, as depicting a certain reality. And in your images, and I think that this is a theme that extends into other bodies of work that we will speak of a little later. The fact that the photographs are posed and staged, it becomes the reality that you orchestrated, the reality that you made. And this is part of your power as a maker, where to contrast that with a photojournalist that wants to show things as they are, and in many cases give the viewer this kind of fly in the wall of seeing the world as it happens. You're presenting to us an event that you orchestrated. This is your reality that you created, no?
I don't know, Ron, I kind of almost see it as like a photojournalist's function is an exclamation mark. And this is more like commas and hyphens and inverted commas. They work at a different rhythm and have a different purpose. The veracity of images, that's a wormhole we could go down. But the same applies for and the same applies for the veracity of words of a journalist.
Sure. I mean, Ashraf Jamal writes, his children are never merely the objects of a vision, but creatures re-envisioned in the dynamics of making a moment, which to me sounded right on target. And these are moments that you're making. These are not moments that you found in the world. And I think
some of them I did find actually like that.
Okay.
Believe it or not, but the majority of them were constructed. Yeah.
I mean, for me, as I look at them, I can't tell the difference, right? I think that the ones that you did find like that look so arranged to begin with, there was no need to arrange them, is what I would assume. So he also talks about looking at these images in a gallery context, which brings us to the idea of not just the making of a photograph, which is what you experience as you're making it, but the idea of myself as an observer that encounters those images. And it could be in many ways that I encounter those images. I could be encountering this on the screen. I could be encountering this on a gallery. I could be encountering this in my living room because I had enough money to purchase a print and put it in my wall, or it's because I purchased this as an NFT. And Jamal talks about the fact that in a gallery, the size of the image is a human scale. And then this makes the experience stronger because it's almost, this is the idea of the photograph as a window, right? And you're looking out the window into a world that you've never been in, to a kind of culture that is not your culture, but it's at arm's length. It's at a human scale, as opposed to the NFT that you're looking at on the screen on your phone. Is there any thought that you have as you're making those images as to the way they would be seen later, or your projects are the making of images?
No, definitely. There are multiple things being taken into consideration. I come from, the first time I published a photo book was, to me, the biggest achievement ever, more than when MoMA purchased a print, or it meant the world to me. So I'm thinking, in terms of a visual narrative, or what I'm trying to convey, and elements that fit together. And then secondly, I'm also thinking about the presentation of the images in a space and the scale of them, and although that often comes secondary. Early on, I shifted from 35mm to medium format and large format because the resolution of the images really resonated with me. Sure. It felt to me like you could touch the pictures almost. Yes. And it added to the images being convincing. and I still very much have that sentiment today. Like a
Convincing in what sense?
believable, even if they allude to their own construction, like that you look at it and you go, oh, this is like right in front of me, exactly as you describe it, like that you're looking outside of a window and it's right there in front of you.
And what is it about a book that is so special to you?
Ron, so I grew up during apartheid South Africa. We had a cultural boycott, and so it was impossible to see music concerts of international artists or international exhibitions. And photography very much fulfilled a political function of conveying to the rest of the world a urgency of an extreme situation that was happening in South Africa. And anything beyond that was seen as navel gazing and didn't really have a space in the art world at that time. And so I encountered my relationship with photography, my in-depth relationship with photography and art for that matter, really started by looking at books. By looking at books from local university libraries, bookshops, and things such as that. So, yeah, that left an incredible impression on me.
And this is, of course, before the time where you could just go online and see whatever you want, whenever you want, as much as you want, right?
Yeah,
you
exactly.
have to go there and find something in order to look at it.
Yeah, which, and so when you found something, it meant a lot, right? Like it's like going to look for a piece of vinyl at a garage sale.
Sure.
And you find that one record. There's no way you can just go online onto eBay and and there's something about that ownership of feeling you discovered something or you worked to, I don't know, it had a different resonance, I guess, to how images are mediated and consumed at the moment.
I mean, I totally understand. I'm very much a believer in the physicality of objects. Many times when I want somebody to look at my photographs, I'd rather hand him a box of pictures and have them hold it in their hand and leaf through them, right? Physically pick one up, hold it, feel the weight in their hand, and then put it down and decide when to pick up the next one. And I think that the next closest experience to that is leafing through the pages of a book.
Yeah.
So, but then that's exactly the opposite of an NFT, right?
I don't know. Maybe okay. I'm not sure. I'm definitely not of a generation that thinks that the metaverse is not real. There are real people, there are real emotions, there is real creativity. The same way that I came to the space of the physical print, and not just that, but the discourse around my practice. Mm-hmm. You're not only making work for yourself to put into the world. You're part of a community of people that are corresponding with each other, and we're using a visual language to do so. Mm-hmm. So if your way into that is through NFTs, and that's where you spend most of your time is in a virtual space or in a metaverse, why not, right? It's a different audience, and photography particularly seems so suited to that medium. It's been so tied to technological developments. Mm-hmm. Painting essentially is oil and pigment, and it's been like that for, this is something that like technology comes and goes, and there's a mass market element to it, which dictates what we have available to us.
Sure.
And I've always enjoyed that element of it. Like, I want my pictures to feel contemporary. I want them to feel like they were made in that time. I don't want to make it feel that it's antiquated from another era. I mean, I don't have any issue with that, but that's not my voice. That's
right.
That wouldn't be authentic. So, the photography has such a,
Well, I definitely think that photographers...
It's inseparable from technology.
Absolutely. I mean, from the very beginning, it doesn't matter if it's chemistry or physics or mechanics or electronics
or optics
or AI for that, or optics or AI for that matter. There's always, I think that I've always been attracted to photography as a medium because of my affinity for technology. So I totally understand what it is that you're speaking about. There's this, the idea of being up to date, the idea of having the latest and greatest and most powerful and highest resolution and the most lifelike. When you're considering your photographs as NFTs, I know that you've published some work. I think Jenny owns uh, one of your series, the Hyena Men, as NFTs. But you've published as NFTs images that you've also published as books, as prints, in other medium, and now they're also available as NFTs. Can you speak to the difference for you between handling these, you yourself handling these images, whether they're on a book or a print or NFT? Is there a difference for you?
I mean, sorry, I'm going to digress a bit, but
Please.
I recently had to put together a slideshow for my father's memorial. And so I went through the old family albums and scanned the pictures. And then there was a point where the picture stopped. And I had to start going through hard drives and old phones.
Yes.
And,
right.
And it wasn't that, my parents were in their, they're close to 80 now. It's not like that shift is like permanent. It's not people experience.
It's not going back.
Right. Yeah, it's in a different way. Whether you and I as practitioners relate to that or not, that's a whole different matter.
It's beyond us.
Yeah, but the consumer of images and its function of communicating history and sentiment and whatever has moved into a digital realm now. And the same is also happening with putting value onto assets, whether it's your specialized gun in a Fortnite game, or if you spend a lot of time in that space, that has currency, right? Like it has I am not at a stage yet where I've been making work. Initially, when NFT started coming around, I was very excited by it, and I thought about making work that spoke to the medium almost exclusively. But it made sense to rather put this work out that I was known for first before I branched into that, and to get a collector base and people that understood the work and the kind of what's the word, like the progression of my work and its themes and things such as that.
And that's certainly happened. But if you were to imagine the kind of work that you would do, which would be NFT work, you have some ideas of what that would look like? Or?
Oh no, I'm making some work.
Okay.
But I'm hanging on to it. I'm not gonna.
No problem. No scoops on this interview. That's fine. Absolutely fine. I've been. I'm not quite sure why, but I've been rereading some Ansel Adams books lately. He's got this series, the five pillars of photography, right? And I really found out that Ansel Adams actually started out as a classical pianist. He was actually performing as a pianist. And there's a whole, I don't know if it's a story, of a mythology, of how he shifted from music to photography and then became, some say the grandfather of us all, and others dispute that. But he's known for saying, and now the saying makes sense to me, that for him, making the photograph is like writing the score, and making the print is like playing the music. And that every time you play it, it's slightly different. And every time you play it, you add different things to it. Part of his entire philosophy is this entire process of, here's the one perfect way to make a photograph, to expose a negative. Here's the one perfect way a print should look. which had its place in time. And it's indisputable that he made very beautiful work in that time. But for me, I translate that into this idea that we were speaking of, in that there's one image, and then there are various avenues in which it could be experienced. It could be experienced online, it could be experienced as a book, it could be experienced as a... but ultimately, I guess what I'm hearing you say, in principle, you don't have a problem with the different ways in which some of your images are presented. They're equally valid for you. They're equally impactful.
Totally. Yeah, essentially that's true. I agree with that. Yeah. I think of it almost as like sampling in a way. One is gathering information, and there's in my process gathering the information, there's a kind of conjunction of intent and collaboration and accident, and you end up with a certain source material.
Right.
And then from that source material, you go, okay, what output to this is going to speak the most truthful, I guess, or have the most, feel the closest to my vision at the time of making it, or sampling it, or conception. And these things also evolve, of course. You come back to different color palettes. Right. Now, increasingly, you have the option to make it in black and white, or you could just put it out as on a digital platform.
Right. I mean, there were the days where you had to remember what kind of film you have in your camera, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's color, black and white, and now there's no such thing. Right? An image is an image, and it could be a cyanotype if you want, just by twirling the dials. And this is some of the, and this is something that you did in your work of the portraits of yourself and your friends, right? Where you took digital images. And for me, those images had a very kind of alt process kind of a look, right? They look very orthochromatic. And I was reading about the making of those and how you took a digital source and you turned it into whatever it is that you wanted. Can you speak to that one a little bit?
Yeah, and from the digital source, the final output prints were platinum prints, ironically.
Oh,
wow. So that's a kind of interesting.
I'd love to see a real one of those. Yeah.
So what I saw first was photographs one would get from a dermatologist when you go to a dermatologist,
right?
And they use UV lights to photograph you to scare you into using sunblock,
sure,
which highlights all pigmentation and skin damage.
Has it worked for you?
Not really.
I'm the same.
I
grew up under the sun, and I yeah. Sorry, we digress.
So, but to do those pictures, you had to keep your eyes closed because of the damage the lights would cause to your eyes. So I started looking for a way to create the same effect, but with the eyes open, so the viewer is confronting. The subject is confronting the viewer in a direct gaze. And I found a technique of doing that with medium format digital, where you capture a gamut, a color spectrum, which is much wider than what you see, and then isolating that and converting it to black and white, but keeping the color channels active, blah, 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 boring. But it arrived at the same result. And then from that, I would print a negative onto acetate, and take that and put that onto contact print, a platinum print of paper that's been coated into platinum.
And have you done other platinum print projects?
No, and I don't think I'll do it again. There's a lot of wastage, and they're beautiful, but it's a commitment. It's a commitment.
Absolutely. Did you actually do all the processing yourself, the platinum, or?
I worked with a printer friend of mine, Tony Menches.
Okay. And I'm assuming that what you have on your website.
These are the digital files. They're not the final prints.
Oh, they're not the final prints.
No.
Are there reproductions of the platinums anywhere
No.
published?
I could send them to you later on. I'm not going to try and track them down now, but
No problem. That wasn't my meaning.
But yeah, they are. Which of
But
course creates
why
another. Yeah. No, sorry.
why platinum? I mean, when I saw those, they really reminded me of, like wet plate negatives, kind of, orthochromatic, early kind of processes. And this is something that has had a resurgence recently, right? There's a lot of people who are doing tintypes, a lot of people are doing calotypes that are going back to this slow process of making the material the absolute opposite of digital printing, of digital photography and digital printing. So I'm pleasantly surprised to hear that for these kind of images, your choice was platinum. What was?
Yeah. Well, for start, platinum gave me the tonality required to express the subtleties that I wanted in those pictures.
Right.
So it was a matter of medium and message, and it worked well together. It wasn't about that it was a sentimental printing process or antiquated. Yeah.
And this is also one of the few projects that you've done in black and white.
That is true, yes. Strangely enough, the other project that I've done in black and white is a series called The Journey, which is a series of portraits shot on an infrared camera of people sleeping.
Oh, yes. I saw. I didn't realize that was black and white. I thought that was.
Well, I did photographers, but I used a green tint in the photographers.
Ah, okay.
But the photographers were made with a polymer printing using a polymer substrate and then put it through the printing press.
Right.
We added green to it so that it emulated the infrared photographs that one associates with, wildlife photography or night vision, military photography, things such as that.
And how large are these, the final images that you made?
They're small.
And
the resolution of this technology doesn't even exist. This camera, I lost it, and I tried to find another one. And recently, while I was on a flight with KLM, there was a warning at the beginning of the flight saying that no photography will be allowed on the plane.
Really?
I really hope that's not because of this project. People have it's strange, these two projects that we've just had in black and white, people have very strong reactions to them. And this is this is one of the few projects where I didn't ask permission to photograph people.
Right, I was wondering about that.
No, I mean, I'm not going to wake someone up and tell them I'm going to photograph you now,
right?
And then go back to sleep. It's like
yes,
defeats the purpose of.
You did a project of homeless people, and you speak about photographing in San Francisco and in LA, and these are cities that have very different attitudes toward homeless people, right?
Yeah, even though they're in the same state. Yeah,
right. Under the same government.
Yeah. So I made a series. It started, I was in a residency in San Francisco. I can't remember the year, but it was a good couple of years ago. And I was it was in the Headlands, which is out in Marin. It's on the other side of the bridge. I had a studio, and what I actually wanted to do was sort my archive out and do some printing. I had my family was with me, and we enrolled our daughter in a school, and the school was in City Hall in downtown San Francisco. And the first day of school, my partner took our child to the school, and she phoned me and said, "You need to come down. You need to come here," because she just knew this was something that would resonate with me. And it started 3 months of photographing in downtown San Francisco, which eventually evolved into photographing in Skid Row, and particularly I focused in the Tenderloin in San Francisco,
Right.
mostly, and then it moved to Skid Row in Los Angeles.
Mhm. And the cities have a very different attitude towards.
Yeah, I mean, at least on my superficial
Right.
observation, San Francisco seemed to me, the Tenderloin is in like downtown, prime
Yeah.
real estate, but the properties are owned by nonprofits.
Right.
It's kind of single occupancy, a lot of it. So they don't have incentive to sell the spaces and make
Sure.
money on it. And if there's someone who is out of it, sitting in traffic, kicking cars, my feeling was the police would come and say, "Come, get out of the street now."
Sure.
And in Los Angeles, that's not how it works. It's much more racialized and much more
Okay.
aggressive, and the police is much more shoot first and ask questions later.
They're the cleanup crew.
Yeah, it's definitely not a civic organization.
No.
That's not what its function is. Or does it? Maybe its civic function is read differently. I don't know.
Sure. Sure.
So, I mean, to me, outside here in my studio in Cape Town, there's homeless people everywhere. There's camps of homeless people, like literally 100 meters away from me. But there was something about, particularly in California, the homeless situation, which I found really interesting. It had like a real anarchic kind of quality to it. And I mean, of course, there's the same gamut. And homeless is such a broad spectrum.
Sure.
I really got the feeling in the US to be homeless was like a full-time job, like just to get registered. Yeah,
But
and the dynamic in San Francisco and LA was very different. Also, in San Francisco, you had all the kind of usual elements, but also there was the leftovers of the freak scene of the 60s.
Right. Burnouts.
Yeah, people who war veterans, etc. And then
well, I'm not so familiar with the situation in California, but I know that in Manhattan, for example, there was a period where there was a huge increase in so-called homeless people because funding for institutions was cut, and people who were deemed to be non-violent but still not fully functional were just released onto the street, right? So it's not really somewhere there's this romantic notion of the rebel, right, that wants to be off the grid on their own, not beholden to anybody. But I mean, these photographs have a fundamentally different feel to me. And this is kind of a strange comparison to make, but I make it only in one sense. We talked before in 1994 about the photographs of the children, the directness of the gaze, this very conscious acknowledgement that they were partnering with you in making these images, and that's their force. But I look at these images, and I'm not sure, they remind me a little bit of the airplane photographs, right? I look at them and I look at the people, and I'm not convinced that they're all there, that they're in a position to understand and give consent to this.
No, not all of them. I mean, it varies from subject to subject.
Right. But there are instances of that. So
Ron, just one second. Okay. Sorry. Hey.
No problem.
Hi. No, this is one of the few occasions also where I didn't always ask permission when I photographed people.
Right.
Often they were out of it, whether it was in a psychological episode or under the influence of substances. But I felt it was important for the series to capture those in-between states.
Yes. But one thing that they do have in common is that they are who you're capturing, that they're there, they're present.
Yeah.
And you're sensitive to who they are and how they are. And it is that sensitivity that dictates when it is that you press the shutter, right? Because you're spending an amount of time in there and you're sampling one moment in time, and it is your decision which is the right moment, right? Or
And
a selection of moments from which you choose one or two.
Exactly. There are plenty of pictures where I feel people's dignity might be compromised.
Right.
And that didn't make the edit.
Absolutely. No,
even though I might have
that's very
photographed.
clear. That's very clear. But a lot of these, I want to contrast this series, which is these are the people as you found them, where you found them, right? In the photographs of the children, I'm assuming that at least in some of the instances, you chose a setting in which to place your subject when you took the photograph. But all of these are of the people as they are. And then I look at a couple of other series. I look at Nollywood, right? This is the series that you did in Nigeria of actors and stuntmen in Nigerian horror movies. Is that right?
Vaguely, yes. So the history behind this project was while I was working in Nigeria, working on the hyena and other men,
right.
Everywhere I stayed, and this is the day before streaming services, and now there's dedicated channels to Nollywood movies in Africa. But everywhere I went, people were watching these locally produced movies, which were made on almost no budget whatsoever.
Right.
And often watching them at incredibly loud volume through broken speakers, which at first this just really annoyed me because of it seemed like the best actor was the one who shouted the loudest. But at some stage, I started getting intrigued by this. A definite sub-genre within the Nollywood movies is the supernatural. And there's something really interesting to me about this. These were movies made by a local audience for a local audience.
Right.
And the history of how this came about is also tied to technology. It's fascinating. It started because someone had ended up with a shipping container of Betamax cassettes. And they couldn't resell them. And so they were, what are we going to do with these cassettes? They were like, let's make a movie. So it's tied to technology once again, which is super interesting. Anyway, I ended up on Nigerian movie sets, started photographing the sets, and I knew I wanted to photograph the subjects in tableaus but remove the kind of puppet strings. I didn't want the lights of the film set and the cameras and the crew. I wanted to present it in a kind of faux documentary way.
Yes.
And this didn't work. It just took too long and was too complicated. Anyway, one day I met a gentleman called Gabazini Zuo. He's a makeup artist. And makeup artist in Nollywood does a lot of other things as well. They're also costumiers and special effects and prosthetics and things such as that. And he had a bag full of photographs that he had taken on physical prints, or photographs he had taken on projects that he had worked on. And I suggested to him that we should collaborate on this project. And I would end up with a series of pictures that, for myself, and I would dedicate the book to him, and he would end up with a portfolio of work that he could use to look for more work for. Could use as a portfolio.
Sure.
And that's how this started. So in these instances, these are very clearly constructed pictures, but posing to be to be something else.
But for me,
they're very tongue-in-cheek also, because
absolutely.
At that time I was also really aware of kind of Western perceptions of reading Africa as this kind of hyper-exotic space. This was like an extended piss take on that, which a lot of people didn't get. It kind of reaffirmed the stereotypes that I was playing with. So maybe as an artist, I wasn't that successful with it, or maybe it was too. Who knows?
I found these images, again, in the context of your other work, to be fascinating, because for me, at least in my perception of your work, one of the things which is very interesting to me is the notion of the real reality and the constructed reality, and where those lines, sometimes those lines are very subtle, right? As in the homeless people photographs, it's an edited selection of an instance of an encounter. Sometimes the creation of the reality, as opposed to finding it, is more elaborate, as in the photograph of the children, where you're selecting a child and you're selecting a background and you're selecting a location of where to make this photograph. And this, in my mind, beautifully takes this to an extreme, where you have people who construct their own presence, right? They're
Well, these are actors for start, so
yes.
their profession is assuming identities, right? Like,
Right.
So even if it at first appears transgressive, it isn't, because
Right.
these are people that are very media literate and very
Sure.
understanding of
Right.
that.
They know exactly how it comes across.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. They have no illusions of that.
Yeah,
And
that's their
you,
craft. And
right. And you, and you, and you document them, or you create tableaus with them, practicing their craft, but outside of the context of their craft, right? Because nobody's filming them and paying them money to be on a film that they're going to distribute. So they're practicing their craft, but they're out of the context of where their craft is practiced. And in my mind, that connects to, I think, one of your more recent series, which is the series of models when they're not being models.
yeah, that's an interesting link. So
To
should
me,
we speak
that's
about that series?
why don't we?
So I think a good way to approach this is maybe just a little bit of a historical inroad. Like, I had no real interest in commercial work or fashion work per se until a few years ago. A luxury brand approached me to shoot an advertising campaign for them based on my, art photos, so-called art photos. And I really enjoyed it. I was surprised. It was so different to personal work, which is so existential and you're on your own and you only get to review the images months later, and maybe they only have a life years later.
Mhm.
This was done, and you have a group of people all working towards the same goal. It's resolved really quickly. You do the best you can, and that's it. You move on. And so I started accepting fashion commissions and advertising commissions. And then a few years ago, I was on a shoot in New York for a magazine, of the magazine Le Monde's weekly magazine, M Le Monde. It was a big 34-page kind of special, and it was around the New York kids. And the casting was done by an agency called Midland, Walter Pierce and Rachel Chandler. And they were very famous early on for casting, for lack of also a better word, outsider models, street cast people that were atypical. And the first kind of campaigns that were really using that was Gucci. Anyway, so when I arrived at the shoot, there was a board up of all the street cast models. Just these headshots taken on a cell phone. And I found these pictures so much more interesting than the pictures I was making once they'd gone through styling and wardrobe and hair and makeup. Somehow a lot of the energy had been lost at that stage already. And so I approached Rachel and Walter and asked them whether they would be interested in collaborating with me on a project where we use the models that they scout and those who are interested to photograph them really just in an identikit style, present themselves. against the white-ish backdrop. Keep it very loose. And we started photographing in New York, and then in London, and then in Paris. And then COVID happened.
Right.
But so mainly in the fashion kind of capitals of the world, where there are runway shows. So COVID happened. I was sitting in South Africa, and after about a year, I found out that one of the people who does casting for Midland actually was stuck in South Africa as well, which they forgot to mention to me.
Right.
And then I ended up photographing in Cape Town and Johannesburg as well, and this is the portfolio of this
Absolutely.
project.
The way you spoke about the photo shoot kind of reminds me the way you spoke about working as a photojournalist, right? Where there's somebody who tells you, here's what you need to do, and here's what the outcome needs to be, and the function it needs to play, and just fill in the blanks and be brilliant, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different voices I use. And certainly one of the styles, aesthetics that I use is a kind of typological approach of stripped down, repetitive, but trying to find individuation in reductiveness, in reducing the elements in the photograph.
Yeah.
And then there's images that are more straightforward documentaries, such as the work of Permanent Error and the Hyena and Other Men. And then there's work or even the Californian Wildflowers. And then there's work that sits somewhere in between, that plays with that documentary space.
I look at your work, and for me, each and every one of your projects plays with the documentary space in one way or the other, right? I see you, and I think it's great. I think it's brilliant. I see you playing with this idea of the documentary from the inside, right? As somebody who knows what documentary photography is, and you're taking it several steps beyond. I was looking at, I think this is also a recent body of work, the work in Mexico, La Cucaracha.
Yeah, that was recent, yeah. And so that's almost opposite of this.
Yeah, exactly. But I want to stay on this idea of, absolutely it's opposite of that. But what struck me with this work is the titles. And there's a lot of work where you very poignantly do not put titles, right? I was reading, somebody was writing about your work and contrasting you with a very famous South African photographer, David Goldblatt, sorry, who has very precise titles, right? He says, this is Mrs. Dixon on such and such a date at such and such a place. And you've got some which are read basically like untitled number 23. And you've got some that have somewhat descriptive titles. But these are the only series that I found where I found the titles to be ironic, or am I reading something, or poetic?
No, maybe
certainly not descriptive.
No, maybe more poetic, and that they allude to elements off the image, outside of the image.
Right.
So maybe this is maybe not the best one to look at, the ranchero, but if you keep going down, keep scrolling. Actually, go up. Go back up to the group of people holding a man. So over here we have an image called After Sequeros. And it is a group of theater performers who work as waste collectors in Oaxaca. And I gave them a reference from a Sequeros mural from the Mexican Revolution of a fallen comrade.
Right.
And asked them to stage this for me.
Right.
So there's a more, organic kind of poetic element in the captions of this. Incidentally, the guy on the right, he just walked into the frame with his ruler. I have no idea. And I love that. I love that.
Absolutely.
Like you couldn't, if you take that guy out of the picture, if you hold your hand in front of him, it's not the same picture.
No, not at all.
He adds so much more energy.
I thought in the mural there was somebody holding a sword or something.
He just wanted to get in on it.
Absolutely.
So
he picture bombed you.
Yeah, totally.
Little did he know, right? It's going to be an NFT one of these days. Maybe not. But this to me adds a whole different layer that I had not seen in the rest of your work, where reading the title as an additional layer. I mean, once you put the title and the image together, the image is never going to be the same once you read the title. And these words are never going to have the same meaning once you've seen the image next to them. So for me, this is a very interesting development and a whole other layer of, dare I say, oh, this is brilliant. Yes, the fake Frida.
I mean, that is a fake Frida, but
it is. It literally is.
I really came from the school of the person's name, the location, and the date.
Right.
And the least you could do is pay respect to the person by giving their name, right? Like you could take the time to speak to them and get their name and their contact details. But at some stage with certain work, that to me felt dishonest because, particularly with Nollywood, there I listed the actors' names, but I might as well have listed the tableau of which I referenced to create the image. And I felt like in this series I got to a stage where I felt confident enough to acknowledge that, the people that I was photographing were performing for the camera rather than being documented.
Right. Which, I mean, even when they're being documented and they're aware of being photographed, they're always performing for the camera anyway, right? If we go back to the homeless people, I mean, the only ones that aren't are probably the ones sleeping on the plane, right?
Yeah,
they're certainly not performing for the camera.
And so some of the people in Californian wildflowers.
Yes, that's what I was referring to. Yes, yeah, good. It's been a fascinating journey. I mean, I think that this sequence that we went through makes a lot of sense to me. And for me, looking and hearing you speak about all these images together, it really contributes a lot to my own understanding, and I'm sure to the people who are watching us now. I'm not sure if there's any comments that are for us to answer. I don't think so. Maybe there will be some. But I really wanted to thank you. Somebody, Osnat is saying that every image is worth more than 1,000 words. Pieter, your image.
Thank you, Osnat. Thanks. Yes, thank you. No, thank you, Ron. Thank you for asking some very intelligent and well-researched questions. And
my pleasure. My pleasure. It was fascinating.
And thank you to Jenny Metaverse for the support. Appreciate it.
Very good. Thank you, Pieter.
And thanks to everyone who came and listened to this. Thanks. Cheers, guys.